What's up, everybody? Today we're going to be discussing how to create tattoo flash, and more specifically, how to create tattoo flash in a way that is consistent with the tradition of creating flash and tattooing. You may be asking yourself, what is flash? Well, I believe the word flash comes from the time when tattooing was in the carnivals, because at a carnival, when they hang the teddy bears and cotton candy and everything up there, that's called flash. It's basically showing the people what you got and what you have to offer. So in the little tattoo booth at the carnival, they would have all the designs everywhere on the walls, and that was called flash. And it was basically, it's to let people know what you tattoo, what designs you have. Nowadays, it's more kind of like personal and kind of like what your style is and things like that. So really, creating tattoo flash is just showcasing your designs and your style and kind of what you have to offer as a tattooer. So really, you can make it with any medium. It could be made with crayon, it could be made on your iPad, or you can paint it with watercolor on watercolor paper. Really, you can make just whatever way that you have to show people what you got. That's technically still flash. What we're going to be talking about in this video is the traditional flash. So traditionally, a lot of times how the flash was created was painted with watercolor on watercolor paper. So when you're talking about traditional flash, you may be referring to the specific designs like these here. These are designs that are all from the early 1900s that have been tattooed and painted and used throughout history. Those are traditional designs. I'm more going to be talking about ways that tattoo flash has been created traditionally. So if you want to impress the cool guy tattooers by making this flash that is kind of within the tradition, the cool guy tradition, then this is the video for you. So we already kind of discussed a little bit with watercolor. So I'm going to go a little bit more in depth as to what you want to use to make good watercolor painting tattoo flash and ways that are consistent with tradition. So number one, I'm going to say the type of watercolor paper that you want to get is going to be Arches watercolor paper. Is simply the best in my opinion. I don't recommend painting on anything but Arches. Personally speaking, I haven't used any watercolor paper that was comparable. And when you get those kind of cheaper stuff like Strathmore and just different pads of watercolor paper at the basic art store, it's going to be really frustrating because that paper sucks really bad. Generally, people are going to be using 140-pound cold press Arches watercolor paper, and that's pretty standard. The cold press watercolor paper is going to be a little bit more rough versus a hot press watercolor paper is going to be a little bit smoother, and the pound rating is going to be the thickness of the paper. So this is a 300-pound, or excuse me, this is a 140-pound. So it's kind of a little bit thicker, but it's kind of thin. If you get into the 300-pound, then that's going to be a lot thicker of a paper, but it does buckle less. So moving on to, let's say, just the outline. In the Sailor Jerry flash books, in the foreword, he says that he used a B5 nib, calligraphy nib, like this. Let's see if I can get it close to the camera there. A B5 calligraphy nib for the outline on almost all of his flash. So a lot of people are using a B5 calligraphy nib to outline their flash, and that's what I used on this sheet here. So if you really want to be traditional and you want to score cool guy traditional points, then you should outline your flash with a calligraphy nib. So this is just a basic Speedball B5 calligraphy nib that I got on Amazon. And I kind of wrap the grip up a little bit there. I think it helps a little bit. I don't know. I like wrapping my grip. A lot of other people do too, but it's not necessary. And now I'll talk about what I prefer outlining my paintings with. There's a lot of different things that you can outline the painting with. Talking about just the ink. A lot of people are going to be using this, which is Talon's drawing ink. A lot of the traditional cool guys are going to be using that for everything. You can line with it, you can paint with it. The downside, I think, to the Talons is it's a little thick, so you got to water it down when you're lining with it, and sometimes it can be kind of shiny, and I kind of like a flat look. I don't really like my paintings to look shiny. Another thing that people will line their paintings with is going to be FW liquid acrylic. So again, with the liquid acrylic, it might be a little bit shiny and it's a little bit thicker viscosity, so it's going to be a little bit harder to line with unless you water it down a little bit. But the cool thing about these is that once this dries, it's going to be really, really dry and it's not going to rehydrate again. And if you're going to be using FW to paint the black in your painting, then it does look nice to have the lines and the black look the same, in my opinion. Now, what I use to line my nib paintings this is Higgins Black Magic. This stuff is really good. It's thin enough. It works good. I had to let it dry for a little while. A lot of times I'll outline a painting and sometimes I'll go back to it the next day just so I can make sure that the lines are going to be dry before I go over and start painting them, just because I'm afraid of the lines rehydrating. This stuff is waterproof, but if you line it real fast and you go right to painting, sometimes that it can rehydrate just a little bit, so be aware of that. Other things you can outline a painting with that a lot of people will outline paintings with that are not necessarily consistent with tradition and the way that using a calligraphy nib is going to be. I think the nib just gives it just the right look. However, a lot of people are going to just use your basic magic marker Sharpie. This is a different brand, but it's basically the same thing. The downside, in my opinion, to using Sharpie or magic marker is that the black that is in this is not a pigment-based black in the way that Talon's drawing ink, FW, or this black magic is pigment-based. And what that means is that there's physical black powder that is what gives it the black color, I guess you could say, for lack of a better term. And versus a dye is just a dye where it's going to wear out over time. So if you take outlines from a Sharpie, they're going to kind of turn purple and they're going to fade over time. And it's not really black, especially against black. However, the comfort and ease and speed of use of using a Sharpie kind of outweighs all the negatives for some people. I'm just kind of particular and I like to have the line look a certain way. And I don't really want to have the potential of the lines kind of fading out of a painting. You know, if I make a painting, I would like to make it last as long as possible. Another thing that a lot of people are going to use that is a pigment-based option in a pen is going to be a micron. Microns are pigment-based, so it's going to be a good black to use. However, I just don't think that a micron has the right look. I'm just kind of chasing like this certain type of look, so that's why I prefer to use the nib. But micron is another good option for outlining a painting. So there are a couple other things that you can also use on watercolor paper to give some special effects. I've stained this with a dark roast coffee to give it that kind of that look. Coffee is acidic, and I have heard people say that if you stain your paintings or anything with coffee, the acid in the coffee could affect the longevity of the paper. I haven't really had paintings long enough, you know, to know how that's going to affect them, but I really like how coffee looks, so I use coffee. Now, let's talk about the paint that we're going to be using. So I prefer to use Winsor Newton watercolor in the tube. I think these just have the best look on the paper. It's very matte. The black can get a little bit shiny if you do it thick, but I just really like the look of the tube watercolor. And again, tube watercolor is going to be pigment based, meaning that there's powder that is the color that you're painting with that's physically going to be on the paper, versus another thing that people like to paint with but is a dye based is going to be the Dr. Martens, what are they called? Transparent watercolor. These little bottles are very easy to paint with. They're very easy to fade with, and they look pretty good, especially this gray. However, it's going to be a dye based, and I've heard people that have had paintings for, you know, just maybe 15 years, and at that time, all of that the color was gone from the painting. So a lot of people like using these. I don't really like using it. I really like the look of a dense, saturated pigment on the paper. And the way that I achieve that is with Winsor Newton tube watercolors. Another thing that people will paint with that is a pigment base, like I was saying before, is the FW liquid acrylic. Pros and cons. Well, let's talk about pros and cons of the liquid acrylic versus just the watercolor for a second. So they're both pigment based. I'd say a con with the watercolor in the tube, or just regular watercolor in general, is going to be that it rehydrates. That can be good or bad. But let's say if you wanted to stain your painting after it was already done with like a wood varnish or something, you're going to want to use FW, because once this dries, it will not rehydrate. A con to the fact that it won't rehydrate is that if you're trying to run a fade and make a nice fade, you kind of have a limited time in order to do that, and you can't really kind of fix or erase. And FW is a little bit shiny. Also, red FW I've found is really hard to get even, and if you kind of layer it or some dries while it's wet and you don't get a large area all turned red, it looks kind of blotchy. Versus the tube watercolor, you can layer it a bunch of times and it's very forgiving, and it looks really consistent and really saturated. So again, I really like using the tube watercolor. And if you want to score traditional cool guy points, use tube watercolor, because that's what the cool guys use. And we all want to be cool, right? So yeah, FW, it works. And if some people really like the fact that it doesn't rehydrate, they like how the pigment looks, ease of use, everything. It's a little bit more of a learning curve, I think, doing it out of the tube than just straight pigment like this. Waverly Color Company also makes liquid acrylic. I bought a set from them. Again, it's good, it's pigment based, it's really dense, but the problem that I have is the same with the FW, is that when you're doing kind of big like pieces of color, it isn't super consistent when you try to get it saturated, and it's hard to kind of get that edge clean when you're doing your fades as well. So now that we're talking about running fades, I'm going to talk about the brushes that I like to use when you're, and I'm gonna get more in depth and talk a little bit more about actually like technique of creating the paintings of everything. I'm just gonna go through, and this is how the series is gonna start, is I'm gonna talk about all the different types of tattoo flash that you can make, and then I'm gonna make more videos going into depth in each one. So this is just kind of scratching the surface of watercolor tattoo flash. We'll get way more in depth in a future video. Anyways, as I was saying, so the brushes that I like using, I use two brushes, one to put the paint on the painting, and then one to fade that paint. I'm using a number 4 size liner watercolor paintbrush. This is from Simply Simmons. This is a round liner paintbrush. That's what I'm putting the paint down with. And then my fading brush, I'm using a filbert tip. This is also a number 4. If you tattoo, this is basically like a curved mag. So the fact that it's curved, I don't know if I can get it really good on the camera. but the top of the brush is curved versus just flat straight across or like pointed like a lining paint brush. I like using the edge of the curved brush to pull my fades, and I think that it works really well. So that's what I use if I'm going to be painting on like an 11 by 14. That's my brush setup that I use. If I'm doing a bigger painting, I'm going to probably use bigger brushes, but generally I'm painting on 11 by 14 or smaller if I'm doing little flash stuff, so that's what I do. Okay, so moving on from watercolor, you can also use Prismacolor pencil, black Prismacolor. Some people will use color as well on watercolor paper, and it has a pretty cool effect. So it's got like a cool texture to it, really pepper shaded, kind of like a tattoo. This one is a mixed media. It's both watercolor and black Prismacolor. So that is another way that people have traditionally made flash on watercolor paper, is using the Prismacolor pencil to kind of get that whip shade effect to it. You can also use Prismacolor pencil, which was a lot of flashes created this way, on stipple paper. And stipple paper has a texture to it, kind of like how watercolor paper does, but the paper is a little bit more waxy. I've never tried to paint on this paper. It's very thin. I don't know how it would go. Generally, what I'm going to do if I'm using stipple paper, you can see it's got a texture to it. So it almost looks kind of stippled. So I'm using a black Prismacolor pencil, and then I'm using just a micron on the lines. So stipple paper, there's a bar outside and everybody's yelling. I don't know if it's gonna pick up on the video, but sorry about that. Stipple paper, a lot of tattoo flash was created on that. So stipple paper tattoo flash is a way that you can score cool guy points. It's consistent with the tradition of tattoo flash. Another method of flash creation that originated in the California penitentiary was just using a simple Bic ballpoint pen. So this is kind of a more kind of gangster Chicano style ballpoint pen drawing, and this is on 140-pound watercolor paper. So you can see you can get a pretty cool effect with the ballpoint pen. In the penitentiary, a lot of times, I mean, they're not going to have Arches watercolor paper. So like back in the day when people were making these drawings, it was on usually white linen, like bed sheets or like a bandana, napkin type of thing. So when I was learning tattooing as an apprentice, my mentor did that fine line gangster style, and so he told me a really good way to create the flash that has a similar look and a similar feel for when you're learning it is to use a ballpoint pen on a linen napkin. I don't have a paño is what they're called. This is Spanish for a bandana. I don't have a paño with me right now, but I'll probably be making a video about how to make a paño or what is a paño. But this is just kind of that same Chicano style that you would do on a paño, but this is on watercolor paper. You can also kind of do different styles. Like this one is obviously a little bit more Japanese, but I kind of use that Chicano style shading with the ballpoint pen to get like more of a Chicano shading look to it, but with the Japanese tattoo subject matter. So that's an awesome thing about tattoo flash. For me is mixing all the traditional imagery and getting to draw and participate and contribute to tattooing and the furthering of the tradition of creating this tattoo flash in these traditional ways, because if we don't do it, it'll die out. So there's a lot of things in tattooing that nowadays that kind of bum me out and may bum other people out, but anytime I see those bum out tattoo things, I just try to come back to what gets me excited about tattooing and what I loved and what first lit that fire. And for me, what really lit the fire and the love of tattooing was just simply creating the tattoo flash and just paying homage to these designs and creating them and recreating them and just the tattoo imagery in general. So anytime that you see something that sucks about tattooing, instead of complaining about it, just go do something that is cool in tattooing and try to do more of that. So I'm going to kind of go into depth in more in a future video and talk about more technique and how to do all these things if you're learning and you want more information. I learned how to paint watercolor from watching Mike Chambers on YouTube. So I don't necessarily think that I'm giving away too many secrets to you guys. And really, if you're in a place where you're seeking out how to create tattoo flash, I think you deserve to know that information. And so this is a way that I can give back to people. And hopefully we keep making tattoo flash and we keep tattooing cool. So thank you very much for watching, and we'll see you guys in a future video.